One of the most common claims is that we had Paley and the watchmaker analogy, and like design arguments were just chilling and having a really good heyday back. And then here comes Charles Darwin in the 19th century, and he just totally destroys design arguments for all of eternity. And no one can ever raise a design argument from biology ever again. So how do you kind of respond to that kind of view where they're going to say evolutionary theory is just like the end of design arguments?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one of my favorite topics, and
Yeah.
I think like there's so many interesting things that you could dig into here.
Mm-hmm.
But one of them is just the historical context that. So, for instance, Darwin was not an atheist, and he was actually sympathetic to at least some really important arguments for God's existence. So he never described himself as an atheist. Later on in his life, he would basically be an agnostic, I think. So that's part of the context. Another part of the context is that some of his main influences were theologians or were apologists. So someone called William Whewell was a major thinker who was a major influence on Darwin, and he was a polymath, so he did lots of things. He was a theologian, philosopher, I think a mathematician. He was actually the first person to, I think, use the word scientist in the English language. So this guy invented the term scientist, William Whewell. He was one of Darwin's main influences, but was a theologian and an apologist, and he basically thought that he argued from the laws of nature to God's control of the universe, to God's existence. And so this really influenced Darwin. I think, and a bunch of people think, that Darwin really took on this growing idea that God is usually using laws of nature rather than intervening all the time. So this idea that God can create through using laws of nature, can sustain the universe and control the universe through laws of nature. This was kind of a growing thing around Darwin's time, and it wasn't like anti-faith. This is what some of the leading Christian thinkers at the time, like William Whewell, many others, were saying. So this was part of natural theology. This wasn't going against natural theology, wasn't going against design arguments. It's actually how the design arguments were already developing before Darwin's time and around Darwin's time. So that's part of the background that's really important.
Yeah. So you're saying then, Zach, because it's super interesting to me, like design arguments, like even at the time of Darwin, like they were in a sense already like accommodated to like evolutionary theory. Like there wasn't really a contradiction when Darwin kind of came out with Origin of Species.
Yeah. So not so much to evolutionary theory, but to some of the background, like the whole idea that what's the balance between laws of nature and divine intervention, I guess. Yeah. And so there was more of a push towards laws of nature because that was the way that science was going. So I think this was before Darwin. There's a guy called Charles Babbage, one of the founders of computing theory. He also wrote one of these treatises on natural theology, and he also emphasized this idea that God can use laws of nature to achieve his purposes just as well as he can use divine intervention. So this was kind of a growing idea, and Darwin's theory actually fit nicely into that. Okay, well, here's just another law of nature. Something like a law of nature, the law of natural selection, is how he thought about it. That potentially God could be using, just as he's using these other laws of nature to set up the planets and the stars and such. We can describe these mathematically in terms of laws of nature. Maybe we can do the same thing in biology. This, if it's not a challenge in the case of the planets and the stars, appealing to laws of nature to explain how they came about, maybe it's also not a problem when it comes to biology. So that's one thing. Another really important thing is there was a major thinker at the time of Darwin, one of Darwin's best friends, called Asa Gray. He was Darwin's main friend and proponent in the US, professor at Harvard of botany. And he thought that Darwin's theory doesn't get rid of design arguments because you still need design in order for evolution to work. That's a very short version, but there are a bunch of arguments like this that were being developed in response to Darwin from people who were friendly to Darwin's science, but thought some of the claims that some of Darwin's supporters were making around design arguments weren't very good because you could still make a different kind of design argument in light of Darwin's theory.
So are you saying then, Zach, like one of the kind of like almost like views of like design, like even at the time of Darwin, is we have this idea of evolutionary theory, but then like a lot of people at that time, I don't know how this translates to your thought today, are like, or they're wondering like, okay, well, there's this evolutionary theory, or maybe there's something like that's going to explain like human origins. But maybe the question of like, why is this whole structure here in the first place, and why is it designed in a way, or at least appears designed in a way to allow for like this evolutionary process to even run in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of argument that Asa Gray was making. So he used an example which I think is really nice of someone who makes cloth by hand. So they sew the cloth, or they weave the cloth technically by hand. And so if you see the product of this person's work, you say, okay, yeah, that's a product of design, intention. But then the same process could be done in Darwin's time and earlier with these massive mechanical looms, they're called, so massive kind of machines that were just kind of in the last few decades were being developed to produce this cloth purely mechanically. There was no kind of human knitting involved, human weaving, or human interaction. It could all just be done with these massive machine factory things. But still, the cloth that you see is still a product of design. It's just designed at a deeper level. So you need design to explain why the factories still produce this highly regular, highly interesting outcome, basically. So the cloth, whether it's produced through kind of human creations directly, or whether it's produced indirectly, created by the means of a factory, it's still designed, and it still looks like it's designed. And Asa Gray, at least, I thought that the same thing basically applies to biology. And I think similar arguments actually still work really well today.
That's super interesting. And I was thinking about that. Is there anything else you want to add here with regards to the idea of like the claim that like Darwin debunked design arguments?
Not really. So I think we'll go into it a little bit more in the next little while, but there's some examples we can talk through. But the basic question of whether you need design isn't really solved by Darwin giving a mechanism, because you can always at least potentially ask the question, okay, why this mechanism? We can think through whether that's a sensible question in this particular case, but it happens in other areas. So for instance, in physics, we might have a mechanism for how the solar system arose. Maybe we can explain that in terms of laws. But we might still be able to make a design argument from that if it turns out that those laws needed to be fine-tuned in order to produce something like our solar system. So this is, the cosmological fine-tuning argument in physics is doing something like this. So if we can do this in physics and cosmology, astronomy, maybe we can do something similar in biology. So at least it's not, obvious that just because we have a biological mechanism that we've got rid of design. But this is what most people think. They think that just because we've got the mechanism, we've immediately got rid of design. And that's just not the case. And we know it's not the case in physics. So I think it also is not the case in biology.